Hello, everybody, and welcome to Away Games, an increasingly sporadic Chicago Cubs and baseball podcast. Because you know what? If Jed Hoyer isn't active every week, why should we be? I'm one of your hosts, Adam Mamawala, here with our other host, Kevin McCaffrey, and the inimitable, formidable Ken Schultz. How you doing, Ken?
Introducing me with the word inimitable, I am immensely better than I was 10 seconds ago. So,
That an absolute wrestling style intro on that.
Yes.
Very well done, ring announcer style.
I'm me, Daddy.
Yes, I'm Kevin. That's that voice. And I was just looking at my phone, guys, to see if we had put out more episodes since the season ended, since the Cubs have made major league signings, and we've done done three. This will be four. Yes, exactly. Now the trade that brought two to the major league roster makes it close, but we still are leading 4-3 in that kind of a ratio. But yeah, at Away Game Spot if you want to check us on Twitter, on any of those things. And we got a nice episode because we have Ken here, which isn't always the case, and then there is actual Major League Baseball news to cover a little bit with the Cubs. And Ken was at the Cubs convention this weekend, so we have a rare reporter from the scene here to tell us about stuff. So where do you guys want to start? Do we do the move analysis at the beginning and then get into the convention?
Yeah,
let's start with that. And I will say, I don't want to, breaking news, but I checked Twitter earlier today, and the name Cody Bellinger was trending right underneath the name Mia Khalifa. So somebody's getting fucked. Unclear if it's us Cubs fans or someone else. But
yet another tough break for our old friend Wilson Contreras. That is unfortunate.
Is Wilson going to slide into Cody's DMs next?
It's
possible. I believe the Dodgers have signed Mia Khalifa to an $800 million contract that will be paid out in 30-97. So
you would think it would be 30-69 from her, but
nice.
But yes, thank you. All right, news. This is let's do the signing first. We got they signed a pitcher from Japan, Shota Imanaga, and we'll tell you that the deal is 4 years, $53 million. There's more to it, but I'm not going to get into all the machinations of that. It could be 5 years and 80. He could opt out if they don't extend it at a certain point. For now, we're going to say it's 4 years, $53 million. He led the NPB, that's the Japanese baseball league. He led them in strikeouts, and he walks nobody last year. He's 30 years old. One of his nicknames is the pitching philosopher, which is pretty great.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we now have
to pair with the professor,
the philosopher.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes, exactly. We need is there doctoring a pitch illegal, but there is I'm trying to think, what do we need to build out the rotation? We have the professor, we have the pitching philosopher. What else is in there? Pitch doctor, I suppose.
Pitch dentist.
Yeah, ooh, I like it. Yeah, it is the pitch that could get you a doctorate.
Yes, we got pitching Esquire. There's a bunch in there, but he's fun. And I know you guys saw, Ken. Did you see how he began his news conference?
Yes, they made sure to play it. Leading into the opening ceremony of the Cubs convention, because it is
best presser since Joe Madden offering the shot in the beer.
Absolutely, yeah. If you want to, an example of how to win over a fan base in the first 10 seconds of your existence with their team, that is the best possible way to do it. That surprise them by starting out your press conference in English, which already, since we've gotten used to the idea of Japanese players talking through their interpreters, and understandably so, to make sure that what they have to say comes across. It feels like, okay, he's already kind of making a special effort to kind of get to know us. And the first words out of his mouth were, "Hey, Chicago, what do you say?" And everybody in this fan base knows immediately what happens next. It's like, yeah, that is honestly the best kind of pandering is the way I can describe it.
It's nice to see someone excited about being a Cub. And the guy apparently was sneakily living in Chicago throughout December, which is tremendous. Ooh. And somehow no reporter found that out, which is, that's cool. That's fine. But it seems like, the numbers on the contract, apparently there were bigger offers out there, and he came to Chicago. He's having fun already. I like the signing generally because I like the player, and it seems
it's cheaper than I think most of us thought it would be.
Yeah.
Big time. It's very hard to fuck up a signing for 4 years, 53 million. You would think, as a big market in theory team, that is that just there shouldn't be that much downside there.
Right.
But he's like the velocity is not like crazy for a guy who led Japan in strikeouts, basically. But his pitches do weird things. He's a lefty with low 90s, up to mid 90s velocity that just does weird shit. Which Justin Steele does that. That works. That's fun. And yeah, just as we're saying, it's just nice to have like a guy that seems to be like excited about being here. That made me happy.
Yeah, and I like that, as you said, that Chicago in winter kind of did the job of recruiting him. Like Jed didn't even have to do anything. And he was hanging out around O'Hare too. Like of all the places where it's just like,
he was just doing guest spots at Zany's Rosemont.
Doing the indoor skydiving
right next to the weed place. It's everything's perfect. It is the best way to kind of appeal to everybody in the city where, I'm someone who hanging out in Chicago was what convinced me to move back here from New York. So to have someone who that the city convinces him to move here from Japan in kind of a similar way, it's like, yeah, I can vibe with that a little bit.
Man, if only the Angels had had a summer road trip to Wrigley last year, Shohei might be a Cub.
No, we should have gotten with Manfred on the scheduling there. We had so Imanaga's great. We will probably talk more about him, but then there was also a trade, and I'm curious to get your takes on the trade. What the trade was, the Cubs traded Jackson Ferris, highly regarded left-handed reliever, left-handed prospect, starting pitching prospect. He was a second rounder in 2022. He was the guy who, when the Cubs sort of surprisingly went under slot for Cade Horton at 7, they used the overage there to get to sign Jackson Ferris away from his collegiate commitments in the second round because he was considered kind of a first round talent. Him and Zaire Hope, who was a high ceiling, also like signed over slot in the 11th round. They were packaged together to send to the Dodgers for Yency Almonte, who's a right-handed reliever, was great in 2022. Numbers weren't as good in 2023, but after he added a sweeper, the numbers were much better. He has no options, so he's going to be in the bullpen. Just saying no options makes me think of being born a Cubs fan, but it's been great. And then they also I guess the headliner of that package is Michael Busch, who by some measures is a top 50 prospect in baseball. He's 26. He's played some third and second. Seems like he's probably a first base DH guy, but he was a Triple A, not Triple H. We're bringing Degeneration X into the mix here.
Yeah, so many wrestling references here.
Suck it, indeed. It was Triple A MVP. He throws righty, hits lefty. I've seen some Max Muncy comps out there for his bat. So that's the deal. How do you guys feel about it? I guess Ken, kick us off.
So it seems like the story that kind of came out right after the deal was, or at least the narrative was, the Cubs kind of took advantage of the Dodgers being in a predicament where they had no position for Busch, and so they had to move him to somebody, and the Cubs swooped in and said, "Hey, we could take that and fill one of our many gaping holes for it, and you can use whatever you
heard it here first. Busch is going to fill those gaping holes.
It's a goddamn miracle." Yes,
yeah.
I realized about halfway through that sentence, it was like, this is not going to end anywhere good, is it? And just went forward with it anyway because that's the kind of content I bring. So. And he certainly, as you say, has the award and the numbers at AAA to at least back up that sense of optimism. My sense, I have two responses that kind of give me pause. First is I kind of worry that trading with the Dodgers now might be the equivalent of trading with the Rays or trading with the Braves in the 90s, where if they're getting rid of a prospect, there's usually, you find out in retrospect, a reason why they're dumping this guy. And also, if he in any way gets in the way of playing Christopher Morel full-time, hard pass, honestly, at this point. And it comes from a sense of Morel has kind of earned an opportunity, but also a sense of, as we've talked about ad nauseum over the past year, I just want guys who I can really like getting behind. And Christopher Morel is kind of at the top of that list at this point. And I want to see him as often as possible, as long as he produces. And I think he will.
Yeah. What are your feelings, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that Busch has kind of been like the presumed, or a presumed starter, I think is how most people feel, whether that's a first base or third base. And I guess that's kind of dependent on, like, do the Cubs go out and sign a Rhys Hoskins? Do they re-sign Bellinger? Because obviously that would impact the first base conversation. Do they trade Morel if they don't feel like there's a place for him? But, like, I guess I don't know as much about the prospects that the Cubs gave up, but I think to get someone who's thought of as not only a top prospect, but someone who's like major league ready and could be coming into what we would hope would be his breakout years, and then someone like a Yency Almonte who not only I think could take the role of like a Michael Fulmer in this year's bullpen, but also great name for obvious shirts, like, you know, oh, you Yancy, huh? Good shirt.
Good shirt. Yeah, let's start.
I'm so Yancy, I already know.
There you go. Yeah, it is a more playful name than we've had join the team in a bit. I think in terms of, like, I this is a kind of deal in sort of a broad way that I do like, in terms of, we've heard so much about the depth of the Cubs minor league system, right? Okay, great. It's nice to have depth to a minor league system. What you should do when you have depth to a minor league system is start packaging some of those guys to have more singular upgrades. Like 3 guys who could be something for one guy who is more surely something is what I want a team with that kind of prospect depth to be doing. Right. So in that sense, they are trading 2 guys who have big ceilings. I think Ferris is a guy who, depending on who you listen to, could have like a 1 starter ceiling. He has a high, he's like big time stuff. He was a high pedigree. This is a guy who also, though, is 19. He is far away from the majors. Who knows what'll happen? So that in that way, they're trading these 2 guys who neither Ferris nor Hope would be on this major league roster for years yet. And this is getting 2 guys to fill spots on this team. Great. But as to Ken's point about, like, what does this tell us about what else they're thinking? Busch, I don't think he's going to take time away from Morel, unless it's time at DH, which is how they used Morel a lot last year. Because it seems like Morel obviously had a lot of problems at third, but he at least has a more athletic profile to possibly get better at third in a way that Busch, from the reports I'm seeing, it doesn't seem like that is actually a third baseman. So it feels like it's more of a first base DH guy. It's basically like, what if Matt Mervis was better? So it's kind of like, this might put a wrap on the Matt Mervis experience right here. Right. What a time it was. What was your guys' favorite part of it?
He did get a hit that one time.
He did. I loved when he canceled an interview on this podcast because it felt like too much of a job. So that was
not aware of that.
Yes.
Kevin had that in his back pocket for a while. He was waiting to pull it out.
I wish him all the best, but I swear to God, this is the most meatball-y thought maybe I've ever had. The way he canceled late and messaged me, he could have just not no-showed us, but the way he messaged me, I was like, I don't feel great about this guy's mindset right now, like going in. But it seems to take him, he sort of jumps Matt Mervis in exactly what Mervis does. It also makes me feel like, all right, if this is a left-handed hitter we have at first base DH, I don't think that's going to wildly change your Cody Bellinger stuff, but it makes me feel more like they might pair that guy with the Rhys Hoskins for 1 year, and maybe Cody is fading out of the picture a little bit.
Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, we can dive directly into the Cody thing from here, because my position on how this is going to go has not changed. And I told this to friend of the pod, Sarah Sanchez, back when we were at Wrigley Winter Wonderland and kind of talking about how the winter was going to go, back when the Shohei Ohtani rumors were still at least in play. And my sense of how the offseason was going to be was that, knowing how Jed Hoyer operates and his aversion to paying anything over what he deems as the most team-friendly contract available, everybody who we think the Cubs are going to go after, including Shohei at the time, is going to go off the board, which has happened. And it's going to eventually go back to the point where their only option to make this a salvageable offseason is to re-sign Cody Bellinger, which is where we are right now. And as we know, if the contract goes in any direction where it might be 1 year too much, or it might be, I don't know, $30-40 million too high, Jed Hoyer's policy for every single time this has happened has always been, and I quote, I don't wanna. And I think that is where we're going to be with Bellinger at a certain point, because Boris, we know how he operates, is if you're not going to give him that number that he has in mind that he wants, okay, fine. I'll sit here and wait until somebody brings it out here.
Well, and it's similar to last year where like signing Swanson was the only thing that could have salvaged the offseason, and they got it done. But you're not always going to get it done. Like they're lucky that happened. But by the time the other three shortstops are off the board, you're putting yourself in a like not a super advantageous position. And I think the only thing that I'll say, I don't like starting sentences this way, but the only thing I'll say in defense of Hoyer, and this is just speculative, is that if the Cubs have the current highest bid and Boris is still not taking it, or Cody's still not taking it, you're not going to bid against yourself. So I do understand that part of it, but I think what we're seeing right now is that for those of us who wanted to be optimistic, letting go of Ross and signing Counsell felt like a signal of like, oh, they're going for it. But if you were pessimistic or realistic, that also might have signaled, oh, no, they're going to do nothing and assume that a better manager is going to squeeze more juice out of the same shitty orange.
like that's a metaphor.
Yeah, it is the orange. We could splash a little vodka in that thing and make it a screwdriver for how I'm feeling about it right now. Because the Imanaga thing, you look at that contract and it's so team friendly compared to expectations. I give credit, that's a great deal. But the only reason I ever care about my teams, especially the Cubs, out of all the teams I follow and root for, a team that relative to the rest of the league is in the best financial position of any team I root for. The only reason I ever care about you saving $1 on a contract is where else that dollar can go. And not to the owners. I want that to go to higher shelf players across the board to strengthen the team. So I love the Imanaga deal. To me, it's an A+ deal. That's fantastic. It gives you, there's upside on it. It costs so much less than most pitchers of that sort of pedigree would cost. Great. But at some point, you got to pick your guy and just fucking get him. And that, I think, is where this team has fallen short, one of the ways in recent years. And I'll give them even credit for Swanson, even though he was sort of the industry's third or fourth pick out of that shortstop class. They picked him as their guy. They clearly focused on him early, went and did what they needed to do there. I just haven't seen that happen like anywhere else with this team. Yeah. And you got to do it more than once every 5 years as the Chicago freaking Cubs.
I mean, I am getting dangerously close to feeling like in the future I will boo Jed Hoyer's widow at a Cubs event.
Yeah,
I don't want to have to do it, but I think I might have to.
Yeah, a lot of just soldiers in Chicago reporting to duty. It's time to go boo a dead man. Got to show my class out here and really do my best.
It's of course, they're not going to, say that we're going to take the savings from the Shota Imanaga deal and pour it into other contracts because, that's just giving Boris the keys to the kingdom.
Of course.
But
yeah,
we have no evidence to this point that he will ever operate in that way. And until we do, if we do see that, it will be a legit great surprise. But the only publicly available evidence we have is Jed Hoyer on the very same day that they announced the deal with Shota Imanaga, telling the media that I take it as a compliment to be considered a small market executive because every deal that I seek should be value. And yeah, I understand that you always want value for it, but the fact that you are taking pride after the past, not just the past couple years, but the past since 2018, the frustration that compounds itself year after year after year as we see Manny Machado and Bryce Harper and Shohei go off the board again and again, and the Cubs not even getting in on it.
Mm-hmm.
To that kind of mounting frustration, to then see that our team president says the quiet part out loud and says that, yep, I I want to operate as a small market executive, and I take it as a point of pride. I mean, yeah, you can't help us believing the way we do right now.
Go to like Cleveland has a team. Minnesota,
Yeah.
the way he also, as we say, we understand. Yes, you want the best value for every contract you do. Ideally that gives you flexibility to get the other better players fit in that into that larger puzzle. But man, he is so much worse at talking than Theo is. It's bananas. Like and I know talking doesn't necessarily win you games. It probably helps with negotiations and stuff. But just he steps in it every chance he gets, and he's not new. He's been a top level executive for like going on to almost 20 years. Like so that is surprising. But when he said that, I was like, I just feel like, are we the poor man's version of the Minnesota Twins now? And if you look at records, I believe it's been five years since we've had a better record than the Minnesota Twins. So I shouldn't even besmirch their name that way. But yeah, he mentioned that he wants to be thought of that way, and we'll see. Cody's still out there. He hasn't signed. Reese Hoskins is still out there. Those are of the remaining guys, the two biggest names I think we've heard connected to the Cubs. Also, like Emmanuel. Is it Emmanuel Clase? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
The closer with Cleveland has also been, that would be a trade, but
yeah. And I don't did Jordan Montgomery sign somewhere?
No,
not yet.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily think the Cubs are going to be in on another starter now that they've signed Imanaga. But to go back to the Hoyer thing, unless I'm wrong, I do believe that the Ricketts have fairly publicly said that they are like open to spending money in a way that they maybe weren't a few years ago when they were talking about COVID and their biblical losses and all of that. And so it's even more perplexing to me that Jed seems to be so intent on conserving money that's not even his. Like when I was a kid and I was out with like my friend's parents and they gave me a $20 bill to go to the food court, I wasn't approaching it the same way that I was with my allowance. So like,
right.
What is this protectiveness that he feels about someone else's money?
Oh, and he was throwing shade at the Dodgers for upping their. He said they passed $500 and $600 million to go to $7, and it's just like, what do you give a fuck? Like what? Like why? You're mad about not even your own team's money. Take care of your own business, dude.
It's the perfect thing for Hoyer to be upset about. And it actually reminded me of way back in now ancient baseball history when Ryne Sandberg signed his record-breaking deal with the Cubs in the 1992 offseason. There was an executive that complained that the Cubs went from $5 million a year to $7 million, like getting in their faces, essentially saying, don't you know there's a number between called 6? And do you want to know who that executive was? Andy MacPhail.
Ah, man. That was he inducted?
That is the mentality that we're in right now. Speaking of Twins-esque mentality.
Totally. Has he been added to the Cubs Walk of Fame, the Cubs Hall of Fame? Was he inducted this
Not yet. No, they're still actually inducting worthy guys. So that's a surprise.
That's true. Yeah. And yeah. Well, I was just gonna say, and that might be a good time to head to the more fun topic of the Cubs convention. Unless Adam, did you have anything else on that run there before we get?
No, I guess in closing, I would just say fire Jed, sell the team over the
hell yeah.
That's Ken Schultz's intro music hitting right there.
Yes, that is my intro and my mic drop. Yeah. That if there has been one constant over the past couple of years, my God, make that an obvious shirt. Wow.
So you headed to the convention. Tell us who you went with. Were you there for the whole time? What was going on?
Yes, I was there on Friday and Saturday with, again, friend of the pod, Sarah Sanchez. We've gone together the past couple of years, and the weekend started with the winter storm coming through on Friday, and in Chicago, like the surrounding areas were all getting snowed. Just snowed to death, essentially.
Yeah.
And in the city, for some reason, it was just like a cold rain had descended on it. So it was like
fun.
hitting Chicago weather with like a layer of clinical depression on top of it outside. And
I'm listening.
Yeah, it's like the perfect way to set up for the Cubs convention, both kind of in terms of how we view Jed, but also like you're going from that outside, and as soon as you walk into the Sheraton, the first thing you hear is the Wrigley Field organ being played in the lobby, and it's like, and all of a sudden we're in baseball season. So if you want to know why Cubs conventions are so like over the top optimistic and happy in so many ways, that is a good part of it, is like leaving Chicago January behind for a couple days and just walking and realizing, yep, it's now baseball season in our minds and everybody is kind of happy to be here.
It is really nice to. Yeah, I've went to the convention once so far. I would definitely go again. It was a lot of fun, but it is it's yeah, it's a very Disney feeling, especially as you say, especially in January to get out of one place and to just see even to just see that much Cubs blue together is like it makes you feel like you are somewhere distinctly different in a fun way and hard not to be enthusiastic.
And there's something also nice about like the NFL starting its massively overhyped playoff season that same weekend, and you're still inside in a hotel with a bunch of baseball fans, and football might as well not exist. And in my world, that's great.
Yeah. They kicked off the opening ceremonies, I guess, is of this week. What is that? Are they doing? I mean, they're doing the player by player intros, I assume.
Yes, they went back to player by player this year because weather kind of knocked out a whole bunch of the guys that were showing up. So they had, I guess, a low enough number where they could bring them out one by one. Last year, they kind of brought them out in groups because there ended up being like 90 people on the stage at the end of last year's. So this year, everybody got their own applause, and it's kind of the standard. Everybody knows how this goes. That they bring out the names. That they start with the alumni that everybody knows. They start with the first guy they brought out because it's alphabetical order. If I gave you, I don't know, 500 guesses, I don't think you'd guess who the first alumni they introduced was. But take a shot. Who do you think?
Is it by last name or first name?
Last name.
I have a guess after you, but yeah.
Did David Aardsma ever pitch for the Cubs?
Oh, yes, he did.
He did.
Wonderful. Sadly, not right, but you are so in the right area code.
That was my guess. That way, because David Aardsma, an absolute alphabetical legend with the AA to begin, he's almost impossible to top alphabetically.
The man who displaced Henry Aaron in the baseball encyclopedia for the guy that was brought out first, David Aardsma.
Oh, that's tremendous. And he was a Cub.
No, the answer is 70s pitching stalwart Ray Burris is the name that they open with. If you want to get the room in an uproar right away, you bring out Mr. Ray Burris.
A real curtain jerker.
But I mean, he gets his love, and that's awesome. Like he gets to high five all the kids who have no idea why they're reaching up to high five. I think it's really great. And so, they started, going through the list, and the biggest pops were for Kyle Hendricks, which is
amazing,
understandable and great. And then right away after that, Shota Imanaga, right after that too. So the crowd, after seeing the "Hey Chicago, what do you say" video, is primed to love this guy. And he comes out to "Welcome to the Jungle," so that's the layer of hype. And it was great to kind of see it's like it reached a new level with Kyle, and then somehow found like a level above that with Shota. And it's an accident of the alphabet, but it turned out to be like one of the cooler parts of the opening ceremony.
Oh, that's so cool. And I love. Go ahead, Adam.
I was just saying, I love "Welcome to the Jungle," but in my mind, I'm picturing Kyle Hendricks coming out to like Johann Sebastian Bach or something.
Yeah, I mean, it fits into the character well. It's Sweet Emotion,
of course.
They played it before one of the sessions he was in on Saturday, and like as soon as they start the bass line with the distortion, like my brain just immediately goes into full on, oh fuck yeah, here we go moment. So like anytime I hear that, it just brings a smile to my face. And the other opening ceremony besides the introductions, they do actually before the intros is they announce who the new Cubs Hall of Famers are, and that's turning into a nice new tradition where nobody knows who that's going to be going in. And there's always a sense, especially this year, where it got leaked that Sammy was on the ballot, thinking, well, that would be kind of an interesting way to get this room in an uproar right away. But Ricketts just says, we're going to introduce our new Hall of Famers, and kind of leaves it at that. And then they do the video that kind of gives you that sense of who it's going to be. And the video started with, the standard overhead shot of the Wrigley outfield. And you hear kind of a familiar sounding voice, like just familiar enough, talking about my dad was such and such. And it's like, that sounds a bit like Kerry Wood's. Oh my goodness, that's awesome. So they had Kerry Wood's son, and Ramos' son, doing the voiceover for the video, introducing them as the new Hall of Famers. And like, as soon as that registered in my mind that that's what's happening, my mind flashed back immediately, Kevin, to you to you being there for Kerry Wood's last strikeout against the White Sox and his son running on the field.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and I don't know, I don't know Kerry Wood's children's situation. I know he's got a few, right? But that is the kid who
Yes.
ran tremendous. Like that's one of my most significant Cubs in-person memories. Really, it's certainly on the Mount Rushmore, because for me, Kerry Wood is like emotionally right there as my favorite Cub of all time. Like he's, with him, Andre Dawson, Anthony Rizzo, are probably three of the four on Mount Rushmore. And I'll have to think about, the fourth probably rotates based on the day.
Well,
but
David Aardsma.
David Aardsma, alphabetically, he has to be at the front of my Rushmore. Yes, for sure. But it was like a weird way to phrase it, but a period of my life where I wasn't openly crying much. And I do remember, like, I was with my friend Cyrus, and we were at that game, and I just happened to be in Chicago. I was living in New York at the time, happened to be in Chicago for that day when Kerry sort of surprisingly announced this is it. And I found myself getting like that level of emotional watching this and just walking off perfectly. And obviously, I mean, the fight, you're already losing it, and then the kid runs out onto the field and hugs him, and then is inducting Kerry into the Cubs Hall of Fame is such a beautiful thing.
Yeah. And the video, like, they handled Cubs Productions is so good at this part. They handled it so well, where it was, back and forth between Kerry Wood's son and Aramis Ramirez's son. And then, climaxes where, you see the quickly edited clips of Aramis crushing one against the Brewers, Kerry Wood striking out the 20, of course, and the music swells underneath it. And the climax is that part where Kerry Wood's son rushes on the field and hugs him. And it's just like, yep, perfect. That's it. Here, now we bring him out to the most applause that anybody's going to get all weekend. And yeah, it was a great moment.
And then Aramis was the other inductee, right? Who is my probably my favorite position player from that era with the Cubs. Yeah. So that this is
I would say, like, criminally underrated Cub. He is 100%. The Kenan Thompson of the Cubs, where it's like, just because you're so consistent and steady and you've been there for so long doesn't mean that people shouldn't appreciate how great you are.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's Sarah said the same thing. Like, as soon as they brought them both out, that she told me that one of the most underrated players of anybody in the major leagues in that era. And I would certainly be inclined to agree that, and we had kind of a long discussion between the two of us, that is he Hall of Fame worthy? And I think where I stand on this is, if it were offense only, he's certainly right up there with Scott Rowland. Unfortunately, Rowland also has defense and base running that add a lot more to his value that Aramis just didn't have. So that's kind of where the separation is. But nonetheless, like, even taking that into account, Aramis Ramirez is still one of the best third basemen of that entire era, and one of the best Cubs of that entire era as well. Yeah. And it's justifiable to have him in the Cubs Hall of Fame.
I mean, that walk-off against the Brewers is still one of my favorite moments ever. And that was, as I recall it, one of the first, like, lens voice cracking moments.
Yeah.
Because that was, what, 2007?
Yes.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, what a fleece job that was to get him and Lofton in the same trade from Pirates. My God, for Bobby Hill and someone else, I think.
And Jose Hernandez, and I want to say Matt Bruback, but I could be
good one.
I could be.
I'm King Jose Hernandez at the time.
Yes, I'm not 100% sure about the Bruback inclusion, but no one's ever said that sentence together before. But I mean, one of the best trades in Cubs history, really. Even though, like, Lofton was just for that half a year, but it was a half a year that could have led to a World Series if things had broken slightly differently, obviously. And then Aramis Ramirez was, so underrated for so many reasons. I think you go back and look at those numbers on Baseball Reference, because they're tremendous. They are surprising, even having been a fan, such a huge fan of his. The power he brought, while very rarely striking out too. Like, the control he brought to every situation. I remember saying so frequently during that time, if this at bat means the game, this is the Cub I want up. I want it to be Aramis Ramirez, just such a controlled professional at bat, and a guy who, like, debuted in the majors crazy early. He was like 21, I want to say, and I think he was partially underrated for his steadiness, as Adam said, but also during that era, Aramis Ramirez was frequently, like, he'd be the second best offensive player on the Cubs that year, where it'd be like Derek Lee's should have been MVP year is ahead of it, or like the ending of the Sosa years or whatever. But he was just second or first best offensive player on this team for a long stretch of the 2000s. So such a cool thing to see.
Yeah.
Him get
it's
celebrated.
one of the best Cubs trades of all time, because I'm willing to admit it's one of the best Cub trades of all time, and it was a Jim Hendry deal, and I
Yes.
fucking hate Jim Hendry. So
yes,
yeah.
you do. Yeah, 100%. It is. You got to give Hendry credit for that masterpiece. Here, we won't get into it any more deeply now, but just a piece to think about. Jed Hoyer, what's his best trade?
Ooh,
Since he took over as the man in 2020, just to ruminate on it, will he ever reach the Jim Hendry level? Let's I can't wait to see. I would love to see one.
Is it a JH thing? Is that like a cursed set of initials?
It's sort of like the Bears have the Ryan and Matts doing the general manager and coach split. It just repeats itself. But we've got that. One thing that interests me that you messaging and tweeting about, Ken, was you getting to see Craig Counsell, the new manager, do some talking.
Yes, and honestly, I came away much more impressed from what he had to say during the convention session than I did during the opening press conference. That it wasn't like the opening press conference was like any kind of massive fail or anything, but watching that, I had the sense of, am I seeing the same thing that everybody else is? Because people were really going almost like over the top. But this guy, it's so sensational to have this guy around. And it just felt like, kind of standard boilerplate, a lot of what he was saying. But kind of seeing him work like an entire room, and it was pretty well packed in, that giant ballroom, which I believe is where you said you went to prom at one point, Kevin?
Yes. Was it at the Sheridan?
Yeah.
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. That my senior prom, the Hinsdale Central High School senior prom, was at the Chicago Sheridan. Yes, that's right.
I don't know why I remember that, but that sticks in my mind. But
yeah,
but it was as packed as your prom presumably was to hear Craig.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah.
At the end of the session, I also wanted to kiss him full on the lips. So I suppose it worked out well. Now, he came across throughout the entire hour he was up there very, very, I guess his sense of himself. He didn't feel like that he needed to sell himself to us, that it was very much a sense of, oh, we're seeing just a real person talking and answering all these questions. And that might be kind of a key to why he does so well relating to all the teams that he had with the Brewers, that there was a real sense of authenticity there that is very hard to manufacture, I guess, for a lot of guys who probably try to do that when they lead a baseball team.
Mm-hmm.
That his answers were full of empathy. And the part that really struck me the most about his session was in talking about the top of the line prospects, the Pete Crow Armstrongs, for example, that get called up and struggle. And him telling the crowd that we should almost expect that to happen because of the pressure that many of us don't understand kind of goes hand in hand with being that level of prospect, that once you get that shot at the big leagues and you get have to confront that change in the level of competition from AAA to the major leagues, that's something that he feels like he especially understands, given what he went through in his career as kind of someone who was a glue guy and someone who was always someone important in the roster.
Right.
He understands the difficulties that come from from AAA to the big leagues. And he says that that's a major part of his communications with top prospects, is letting them know that you're going to struggle, but you're going to play. And I will not let your struggles kind of get in the way of your development at this level. And I'm kind of phrasing it in kind of a halting myself, because I'm trying to remember the phrasing he used. Mm-hmm. But when he says it, it's much more.
No, I mean, I think that's that's one of those things where partially maybe why we see such this caliber of player so frequently end up as a manager, where Counsell was not. I don't think he was ever on a top 100 prospect list, maybe, but like he was never a PCA type of blue chipper, but he played in the majors for a very long time. And this is a guy who won a couple World Series as a player, so he's been around players who are as big as it
Right.
gets, and and has and I think it is, in a way that like Ross probably had some of this too, right? This caliber of player who's had a lot of success and has seen players struggle, get better from both sides of it. But I think it probably makes a lot of fans who maybe did have beef with some of David Ross's decisions hear him just put out that sort of, feels like kind of a comforting blanket of confidence for players who are coming up.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there were times, not to disparage Ross, but like because he was new at the job, there were times where during a press conference or when people were talking to him, he did have that air of like, I'm trying to sound like what I think a manager should sound like, and it just came through as like not being as sincere as we have seen him be in other situations. So yeah, I agree, and I think that's a good point about like the kind of player that Counsell was. I rarely do this, but to quote a joke of mine about how I intentionally seek out going to barbers who are either fully or almost completely bald, like it's part of the ethos that like the best coaches are bad players. Like I don't want someone who hasn't struggled in that position.
Sure.
Right. I want someone who like appreciates it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, who didn't have blue chip hair, needed to take what they had and work it into something that played up a level, perhaps.
Right.
And to prove your point, your haircut now, spot on.
Oh, thank you so much.
Well done. Yes.
Well, David Ross cut it, so.
As opposed to John Lackey?
Yeah.
Right, well, yeah. He didn't come here to cut my hair.
He came here for jewelry, but
exactly.
So I think, and to your point about the things that David Ross said during his press conference, that during his press conferences after games, the one thing that kind of sticks out in my mind, the characteristics of that, was when he wouldn't want to answer a question, he just wouldn't. He flat out would kind of just shut the reporter down. Mm-hmm. And it's tough to say since we haven't seen, any actual gameplay under Counsell, how that's going to operate. But just kind of given how his session went and how open and honest he was, I'm kind of hoping that won't be the case with him, that we're going to get, it won't be the same as, Joe Madden, who every question will get a 5-minute answer and
right.
Full justification for why, this happened to him coming up through the Angel system in 1982. So that's why he did this now. But I get the sense just from how Counsell was in that session that there's going to be a lot of that just kind of openness and honesty and that will help make the adjustment a little bit easier,
especially when we're not getting it from the GM.
Oh God, no. Yeah. And then that's the thing too, to kind of tie this together a little bit, is that I think Counsell himself mentioned this during his session. And I know Jed mentioned it during his, that when Jed was secretly recruiting him, Counsell told him, look, if you want somebody who's just going to be concerned with bullpen management, I'm not your guy. I'm much more about reaching out to people in that clubhouse and getting the clubhouse kind of all pushing in the same direction. And I thought that's certainly a great soundbite, but also that's the one thing I can guarantee we had under David Ross. Because
players were fans.
Yes, they're big fans. And last year, that big push that happened from mid-June through the end of August, I don't think happens under a lot of managers, because that's the one real strength David Ross has, was keeping that clubhouse together and focused and on the idea that we can still get back into this. We can still force them not to sell at the deadline. And everybody bought in, as you saw.
Yeah, and I think that's one good thing about the Counsell signing a little bit. First of all, I think it probably gives you some confidence to have the record for a manager record-setting 5-year, $40 million contract. You probably aren't sweating it so much as managers who feel like they're new or on the cutting block might be. But what I like, and I think probably we all like here, knowing how we feel about all these moving parts, is when Craig Counsell says, he mentions that he wants to be here for like team building and that kind of stuff too. I think in terms of influence on signings, you would have to think that Counsell's carrying more weight there than his predecessor, right? And that doesn't mean he gets to write the checks or anything. But if you're telling me you can maybe slide a little bit of the influence away from the president of baseball operations in this setting and a little bit towards an accomplished, well thought of manager in a way that Ross didn't have the pull to maybe do or to put the pressure on in the same way, I gotta like that,
Mm-hmm.
And anything that involves less Jed, I'm all on board with.
Yes.
Sure.
So I thought that was cool to see your take on getting to see Counsell in a way we haven't, maybe
Yeah.
up close and in person.
That was one of the best sessions of the day, honestly, was
Yeah.
getting to see him like that. And the other thing that really sticks out about the Cub convention in retrospect that I want to make sure we discuss too is it was, as I say, all the positivity and happiness that it usually has. But underneath all that, there was that underlying sense of, okay, let's start seeing what you got here, guys. Because every single session at some point had Cody Bellinger lingering over it, whether it was a Cody chant, which greeted Tom Ricketts as he went out in the first 5 minutes, or whether it was, and I want to look up this quote up to make sure that I quote it exactly right. Dansby Swanson at the very end of the hitter session, before we get to next year, we've got to re-sign Belly. And the entire room went up for grabs at that point. That was the ultimate mic drop moment. And that's kind of to what we were discussing earlier about Counsell having maybe a little bit of influence. I mean, we know Dansby Swanson has his say to Jed Hoyer, and that is the most public way to send that message.
It's fun to have someone saying anything, and it is, and that is rare in a way where you see a player outright say, sign this specific person. Yeah. We say Adbert Alzolai does that on Twitter. He's called it out that way a couple of times too, which is very fun. But it seems like the players really do want Cody. And we've heard, they joke about how Dansby is always like blowing up Jed's phone and all that stuff, and they should get him khakis so he can just be walking around in the office up there. Also, Dansby's wife just signed a record-setting contract to stay in Chicago to play soccer. So that's pretty fun. But Dansby and his wife are pretty invested in this town, so it makes sense that he'd be talking like that.
With the Red Stars, who are owned by Laura Ricketts.
Yeah, there you go. Taking all them Ricketts money. You gotta love that.
100%.
I love Dansby. Like, Dansby knows what he's doing. He knows what kind of response that's going to elicit. And I tell you, if it hadn't been so cold, I think people might have January 6th the Wrigley Field there, I think.
Would have been a January 13th.
Just rev them up, baby.
It's the entire weekend. As I say, people were finding ways to ask that question in every session. And for the most part, Jed certainly wasn't going to address it directly. And the players, for the most part, had figured out ways to kind of talk about respecting Cody without, doing anything, saying anything direct. And it was a moment, I think, where Dansby Swanson, it wasn't even asked about Cody specifically, but Dansby Swanson, I think, just had a moment where it was like, fuck it, I'm going to say it and see what happens.
It was great. Yeah. And it's fun to have, it's Dansby doing that, and the way Imanaga came in and announced himself. It's just fun to have players being like noticeable human beings, like acting like humans instead of. It's nice when your team doesn't feel like a hedge fund. It's nice when it feels like there are human beings here, and that was So that was cool to see from Dansby.
It was my favorite Dansby Swanson moment of his entire tenure in Chicago so far, and it gives me hope that if frustration keeps boiling, that maybe we might have a shortstop on team fire Jed, sell the team.
That would be funny. That's how he gets on the Ken Schultz Rushmore for sure.
Oh yeah,
I heard he was wearing a nice cowboy hat the first day.
Yes, he was. He was the only one who came out in headgear accoutrement, and it feels like you're from Georgia. I know that's not technically cowboy country, but it might as well be.
I have to give Jed credit for this. I believe it was Jed who pointed out he's from suburban Atlanta. Like, it was. He did point that out. I was like, that's a pretty good call.
I mean, John Lester wore cowboy hats everywhere, and he was born in fucking Washington. So.
Yes. Right. Now you got to see the live compound as well, right?
Yes, it was great again. Like, Ian Happ is so good at, as I think we talked about this last year, so good at kind of diving into baseball player specific minutia. So getting his fellow players to kind of open up to him in ways that they don't around most other media, but also making it accessible to people just listening for fun listen. And it had a real good discussion with Dansby and Nico at the start. So you feel like, 3 Gold Gloves on stage, that they've got that bond forever. And then he had Adbert and Justin Steele talking about Steele's wedding and the fishing trip, and that's all good. And it ended actually with him and Ben Zobrist, who overlapped in the last couple of years of Zobrist's career. And Zobrist kind of delved deep into, I guess, early on when Hap was still a prospect coming up through the system, they had Zobrist spend a day with him at spring training just to kind of, hey, here's a guy you might want to emulate. And it's Ben Zobrist, so of course. And Zobrist kind of talked about the mindset from a veteran standpoint, and that goes into that, where that if you're at a point in your career where you're financially secure, you have your contract, and you have a legacy, he said it's much easier at that point for a veteran to go up to younger players and to impart wisdom, because you have your legs under you. You've done what you need to do, and you also have things you can point to. And Zobrist also talked about so many veterans still have that kind of level of insecurity, where if they're still playing for their next contract, or if they haven't quite done everything they want to in the major league level, those are the guys that you kind of got to watch out for, because they might undercut the young players. And it was just kind of a fascinating, like, honest look into like that particular part of the ball player neurosis and the ball player mindset. And I think they just published it on the Compound's feed, so it's well worth a listen if you give it a chance at some point.
No, go ahead, Kevin.
Oh, I was just going to say that is great, and especially you saying that there are players who will undercut you from this position is something that most players just don't talk about that. So that's a credit to Zobrist is he's a candid guy and an interesting conversation in general, and also credit to Ian Happ and how thoughtful he is and how good he is at that job.
Yeah, and I think that's also a good reminder that like that dynamic exists in every workplace. It can be baseball, it can be your office, that sure as hell exists in comedy, where like some of the biggest assholes are people who are like medium famous because they're not where they want to be, but they also feel threatened by you, like, knocking on their heels, or whatever the phrase would be, where like somebody asks you who books a club that you worked at, you don't want to give them that information because you feel like they're taking food off of your plate. Whereas if, like, I don't know, if I asked Roy Wood Jr. for a recommendation, he would give it to me because he's like, yeah, you're not a threat to me in this moment. Like I'm already where I need to be.
He's on the roster. He's got guaranteed money. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Like he feels legit that way. And also it's a little bit of just people who believe in their own talent too. Like as there have been some very famous comics in my world too that were very cool to me before they popped in a way they have since. And then there's the medium level douchebag who sometimes is a little more famous but isn't good, and like they know it somewhere,
Right.
and that's going to be the
just waiting to turn back into a pumpkin, as it were.
Yeah.
But yeah, I thought Hap did a great job. I didn't get to listen to the whole episode, but he's really, I don't know if it was the intention when they started the podcast. Obviously it was like out of desperation and boredom during COVID, but like he is, in my mind, very much setting himself up to be in broadcasting, or at least like, on MLB Network or something like that after his playing career, which hopefully isn't for a long time. But I thought one of the best questions he asked was talking to Steele and Alzolay about how they've kind of had this role reversal where like Alzolay came up as a starter, then turned into a reliever, and Steele was the opposite, and asking like how the preparation for each of those respective paths has helped them in terms of like, starter background, now you're relieving, and reliever background, now you're starting. And I thought that was just a really like simple but astute question.
Yeah, and Steele mentioned that he kind of takes that reliever mentality into how he approaches a start now, where he just breaks it down inning by inning, where this is, okay, I've got to close out this inning, then next time I go out, I got to close out the second inning now. And it also really illustrates how much the game has changed in terms of starting pitching and that particular mindset, because that's the way that most starters operate in the current environment, where you're maxing out on every throw, and you just have to view it as trying to shut them down each inning by inning. Whereas, even I would say as recently as maybe 10 years ago, you had guys like John Lester who would be going out there with the sense of, I got to get at least 7 here, which means I got to conserve some bullets, and I got to start out by feeling out the strike zone before I get into shutdown mode. And so you would sometimes see Lester struggle through 30 pitch first innings and then end up pitching 7 or 8 because he eventually figured it out. But that does not happen in a mentality where you're like, okay, here comes the closer in the first inning, and here comes the closer in the second inning. And it's not to say that either is necessarily better or worse than the other, but it's just how different baseball is now.
It's different, and it's Go ahead.
I do think that Steele, when you talk about Lester, you can tell that he has that approach, because he, especially for a fairly young player, is very good at doing that thing where even if he goes out and gets knocked around in the second inning, when the third inning starts, it's like it never happened. And that, I think, is the hallmark of a really great starting pitcher, is that like Lester would go out and give up 3 runs sometimes in the first inning, but then you would look up and he just finished 7 innings only giving up those 3 runs. And for a lot of other people, they don't have the mental toughness or the wherewithal to throw that away and be like, all right, that sucked, but like I still have a job to do.
Yeah, and it's extremely encouraging to hear that, because I mean, you hear Steele get comped to Lester all the time because of the style that they have, and because Lester has, phoned him up and helped him out in the past. But having that particular mindset comp, I think, is essential, because that's how you end up winning a whole bunch of games at the end of the year.
Yeah, and I think one fun thing as you're about the Cubs convention that was, maybe it seems obvious, but I think it's a thing that the organizers have done a really good job of, is giving you a place where you get to see the players talk to players publicly, because you don't see that. I mean, sometimes during the year there will be like YouTube features, right, where there's things like that. But talking about like Adbert Alzolai's friendship with Justin Steele and how deep it goes and how far, I mean, because those guys were, in very small towns together, coming up together. They're very good friends. They were roommates at one point, I believe. They, and they were together at the guys at Justin's wedding recently. And hearing, as you said, Zobrist and Happ talk, and it is such a cool thing. And it reminds me of when I went to the convention, and Ken was there too, the year after Happ's rookie year, I want to say. I know it was leading into the year where he was sent down again. And I remember just being struck by how thoughtful and interesting and intelligent and funny that this guy could be on those panels. So it's cool that they give you the player-to-player experience that in a way you don't get anywhere else. Were there, I guess the last question I have, Ken, were there any other like fun player-to-player interactions you saw, or any, or even any standout, just like story or anecdote you got from your times watching these dudes?
Yeah, and real quick, Ken, before you answer that, I was just going to say about the compound, and I still like listen to every episode of that. And there are plenty of better baseball podcasts, and like half the time these guys don't even know how to like talk into a microphone properly. But I think the coolest thing about it is that I've never, maybe there was one, but like I was never aware of a podcast where you're hearing ball players talk about the process so much, or talk about it during a season. And just in the time that has been on, which is now 4 years almost, look at the trajectory of the people involved. Obviously, Nico was involved at first, but you've got Ian Happ, Zach Short, and Dakota Meckes. And at that time, they were all at the spring training facility. Ian was barely removed from having been sent down, didn't know what his future was going to be. Short was a guy who was like trying to make it. Meckes was in the same boat. And now 4 years later, Happ is an extended all-star and gold glover. Short is in the big leagues, but in that kind of like back and forth from the minors to the majors. And Meckes is out of baseball and going back to school. And like, it's a great illustration of like, yeah, you could all have been in the same place a few years ago, but there's a lot of different trajectories for people in baseball. And it's cool to like, obviously it sucks for Dakota Meckes that he never got to do it, but like, that's how the sport is.
Yeah. It's a really good point, because that's an honest look about, these are, examples of a life in baseball. And this is what could happen if things break your way, or if you have a certain level of talent. And this is also what could happen to the vast majority of guys who attempt it.
Right.
Because, I mean, that's life in baseball. That's life in
Happ is the anomaly. The all-star winning Gold Gloves. That's the anomaly.
Big time. Yes. And in terms of other good parts of the convention, player to player, it's natural that I head here when the first thing you think of when you're asking me what other highlights pop into my mind. And I'm going to go straight to the 2016 reunion, which was it. I guess in terms of player to player interaction, the most striking part of that was just Miguel Montero can talk about 2016 all goddamn day, as far as I'm concerned. That he is still as blunt as he ever was.
I love it.
Is willing to be as honest as he ever was. And in sessions like that, like, he's the one that drives it, man. He told a story, and this didn't really occur to me until he talked about it. Coming in to Game 7 after replacing David Ross defensively, and having to come in that 9th inning and try to work Chapman through it. And he mentioned that he had not caught an inning of the World Series until that point. So he was having to figure out how to navigate the top of Cleveland's order in the 9th inning, when they could walk off the World Series, the inning after they've just tied it. And he had no idea about batter tendencies, or who what they were doing in the box other than what he was viewing from afar. So he was just kind of making it up as he went along as best he could. And to hear
That
him
still gives me anxiety retroactively.
oh yeah. Yeah, like the entire room, you could just feel like, oh, how did they win this thing?
Yeah.
You also kind of go, yeah, good on you, Miguel Montero, for figuring that out. And he mentioned when Montgomery came into the game in the 10th inning that they talked on the mound briefly about how what Montgomery came in and asked, okay, so what do you want to do to this guy, Michael Martinez? And Montero mentioned, I've never seen this guy before in my life. I had no idea.
Well, even the Cleveland fans hadn't. So
no, yeah. And so I think he ended up saying to Mike Montgomery that I'll figure something out and walk back behind the plate. And sure enough,
it's like a rookie of the year ass speech right there. Deal from your have to.
Yeah, and didn't he like only call sliders basically? Like
he mentioned that about in the 9th inning too with Chapman that it was going to be just a bunch of sliders, and he said that he could see behind the plate a couple that, oh God, here comes a hanger now, and then when they fouled it straight back, it's like, okay.
Well, I think it was Roberto Perez who got under one, and then Kipnis obviously like hooked that one down the line. Right. There were a couple that were meatballs.
Yep, big time.
That's great. Yeah. And he's such a fun guy that I feel like, you know, the way he left the team after he sort of candidly was like, well, you know, some of these stolen bases, they're not all, some of them I can't do anything about with Jake Arrieta. And then I do remember him getting a smattering of boos when he came back after the trade, and I was pissed about that. I'm just not a boo a Cub guy in general. Sorry. I don't boo Wilson. I don't any of these fun catchers we have. I'm not gonna boo Ross. Not booing any of the 2016 catchers, of which there are many. But he is such a fun guy, and I'm glad to hear that the feelings now are completely positive about him.
Yeah, and he gets a big applause break during the introductions, and the Cubs make sure to introduce him all the time as the man who had the game-winning hit in Game 7.
Yes,
and important hit in Cub history. So,
that and also on the heels of one of the other most important hits in Cubs history, which is the grand slam in the NLCS. I mean, that's I think in my lifetime as a Cubs fan, that's probably a top 3 moment.
Yes,
it's one of the loudest I've yelled involuntarily. I know I went from a sitting position to on my feet in my bed, and I didn't remember that happening. I just knew I was standing and my head was scraping the ceiling at that point, and him hitting that, and such a guy of his confidence and just vibe. The lean back after the way he hit it and just like enjoyed it immediately was such a purely joyful moment of that ultimately joyous run.
Yeah. And it was honestly, I want to make sure to get this across too, just an incredible time that session that, again, the room was packed. People really wanted to see these guys again. And it was Zobrist, Montero, Pedro Strop, because you got to bring some awesome, Hendricks, and Justin Grimm. And I just remember that general sense watching it for the 40 minutes that it went on, that at some point the thought entered my mind that I am having an emotional response to this. I am up in my feelings here. And it wasn't really even anything being discussed on stage. You know, they were players giving each other shit and having fun on stage for the most part. But just kind of being in the room where there was this level of gratitude and just joy to see these guys again. And you really just felt good watching this. And that's what that team continues to bring. And it's why, as you say, I'm going to still love Wilson and obviously Rizzo and KB and Schwarber and everybody who comes back this year. I hope that vibe continues.
I feel like it's not just their success, it's their humanity and fun too. And we lucked out that our best team ever was also probably the most fun, you know, just in terms of the guys too.
With a couple notable exceptions, one at the time and one in retrospect, but largely for sure. And speaking of loud moments, I mean, Kevin, I would assume that for you, other than maybe the Javi Baez now forgotten game tying double in that wild card game,
Rockies,
I have to assume the Justin Grimm double play ball in Game 3 of the World Series is like one of the loudest Wrigley moments that you've experienced.
It is the singular loudest Wrigley moment I've experienced that I'm aware of is the Justin Grimm double play in Game 3, and I know it ultimately led to the result wasn't what we wanted at the end of that game, but that moment was the loudest moment of that game, and the loudest and I'm sure some of the feeling informs this sort of a memory. I didn't have my decibel reader on me, but that was the loudest I've ever experienced Wrigley. Was Grimm's.
And the replay of that with him like pumping his fists and the crowd behind him, like it's one of those where like you feel like you're watching a movie when it's happening. Yeah. So it does also, hearing you real quick, Ken, talk about like all of our guys that we love who are now, of course, on other teams. It makes me excited to think about what a Cubs convention 10 years from now or 15 years from now is going to be when like all those guys are able to come back and we get to like see that team together again.
Yeah, and that's going to be the thing too. That's going to be a special moment when we finally get everybody back under the same roof and give them the love that they deserve and the gratitude that they deserve.
Yeah.
And it's the thing too that even guys who were kind of, I don't know, second tier sounds a bit insulting, but guys like Grimm, who weren't the first people you think of on that team, a lot of them have their moments from that year. That Justin Grimm has the double play, Matt Caesar has the grand slam against the Braves early on in the season,
and his bat being used.
The Caesar bat.
So it goes beyond just the stars that everybody knows and loves. That there are moments from just about everybody on that roster, and then there is love for just about everybody on that roster who is not a piece of shit.
Yes, exactly. 2 out of 25 on the downside ain't bad.
No, I mean, I think maybe my favorite moment ever of doing this podcast, possibly with the exception of talking to Joe Madden, is hearing Rob Zastryzny, who wasn't even actually on the World Series roster, talk about the rain delay speech and being like, holy shit, I'm talking to somebody who was sitting there listening to Jason Hayward give the most important speech in the history of this team.
Yeah. And that's great, and that is a nice memory. Going back through our years of doing this podcast, Strisny was really one of the highlights for me too. Just a guy who, as I said, he got a ring. He showed up that year and stuff, but such a
replaced
nice
by Kyle Schwarber on the World Series roster.
Yeah, and such a good guy and so thoughtful, and that was a nice moment. Cool. Well, I think we're good here. Adam, did I miss anything? Anything you want?
No. This was fun. I guess, Ken, did we miss any final CubsCon moments?
I mean, there were a couple other highlights, but nothing that we have to dive too deep into. I went to a session where the sculptor of the guy who's done all the statues, Lou Sella,
cool.
Kind of had some fun Ernie Banks stories that he shared, and
that's cool.
Also revealed that the Ryne Sandberg statue is June 23rd, the 40th anniversary of the Sandberg game this season. So
love it.
Figured people should know that.
23. How perfect. Yep. All the way through that. That's awesome. Cool. Ken, tell them where to find you. Tell our phone listeners.
So I am on Twitter at Ken Schultz _, on Instagram at Ken Thin Guy, and you could read my words at OutSports. I just did a piece at the end of last week that I'm proud of, diving deep into Riley Gaines, a former University of Kentucky swimmer who competed against out-trans swimmer Leah Thomas and then became a right-wing media darling. And you would assume, based on that narrative, that it must have been, a heart-shattering loss to Leah that caused her to turn full heel, right? Turns out that in that meet, it was a tie for 5th with Leah Thomas. So, yeah, that's just a perfect encapsulation of right-wing grift. That if she got what she wanted and Leah Thomas were banned from competing, she still would have fucking finished 5th.
That is beyond parody. It is.
But she wanted 5th alone. She didn't want to have to share it with someone.
Don't want to share a participation trophy. That's not, Oh, God, perfect. What a fucking dingbat.
Striving for 5th, a Chicago Cubs podcast.
That's perfect. Please read Ken at OutSports. Follow Ken. Just one of, as I phrased it many times, one of the best writers who happens to write about sports is Ken Schultz. Follow his stuff and
cosign.
Yeah, and Adam, anything to plug for you, Adam, on anything new?
Oh no,
no. Fuck no.
I wouldn't dare.
If you happen to be listening and within range of Arkansas, Northwest Arkansas, I'm going to be at the Grove January 26th and 27th, recording my second album there. Actually, I was there once before. It's a great fucking club. They make people put their cell phones away, and they actually do it. And it's a good time. That'll be album number 2, recording there. So that's January 26th, 27th in Northwest Arkansas. And just at Kevin McCaff on all the things. This was
Don't
nice.
even think about doing the wave at those shows. I swear.
No, I would be so disappointed for a number of reasons. You can't hear it, for one thing.
Snake Cups welcome, waves banned.
100%. Ken, thanks for doing it.
Always a pleasure, guys. Love seeing you.
Adam, lovely to see you.